Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to this webinar on This is How They Tell Me the World Ends, the Cyberweapons Arms Race. We have an outstanding speaker in Nicole Perlroth, who's going to describe to us her experience as a journalist looking into this area. And I know we are in for a fascinating time. My name is Hugh Morris. I'm a Senior Research Associate with Zien, and it's my pleasure to be able to chair this event. And I can only do that thanks to the generosity of our sponsors. And as you can see, that we have a wide range of sponsors who, thanks to them, allow us to range widely and freely across technology, economics, and finance. And that is how we're able to put on the webinar program, to which we are delighted to welcome you. So my job is to get out of the way as quickly as possible and hand over to our speaker. Some housekeeping notes. The slides are available to download in the chat and on the website. We'll be holding a Q&A for 20 minutes after Nicole has spoken. Please make sure that you use the Go to the Webinar chat facility to send your questions into me, and I can then feed them into the conversation. Now, let me hand over, without further ado, to Nicole. The floor is all yours.
Thank you so much, Hugh, and thank you to everyone at the FS Club and the sponsors for having me. And most importantly, thank you to you all for joining what I'm sure is your 1000th webinar of the pandemic. I really appreciate it. So we have 20 minutes, so I thought I would just walk you through how I got to the place I am now, calling out the imminent end of the world. 10 years ago, actually to this week, I joined the New York Times, and I think it's helpful to know that I actually had no technical background when I joined the Times. I was happily covering venture capital and technology startups, but I wasn't deep in the code when I got a call from the New York Times and they said, "We're looking at you for a job, but we're not sure you're going to want it." And I said, "Well, you're the New York Times. I'll take whatever it is. How bad could it be?" And they said, "It's cybersecurity." And at this point, I had not only did I not know anything about cybersecurity, I had actively gone out of my way to learn as little about cybersecurity as possible. But I agreed to go to these interviews. I went through the process. I thought I would tell my kids one day that the Holy New York Times had invited me into the building. And I even brought along a list of cybersecurity reporters that I thought would be great candidates for this job. And so when I got to the Times, they said, "What you don't understand, Nicole, is that we've already interviewed everyone on your list and we couldn't understand a single thing that they were saying." What they really wanted was a translator, someone who could communicate these very technical issues and technical threats to a lay audience. And so began my job at the New York Times, my illustrious entry to the hallowed halls of the New York Times. And you can just, or Peter, you can switch to the next slide here. The very first thing that happened was Anonymous, which was this loose hacking collective that was basically taking aim at everything from the Scientology church to the CIA and FBI and PayPal, basically anyone that they deemed an impediment to free speech, they would basically try to knock offline. And so I spent my first year at the Times sort of running around, writing about every time that Anonymous was able to knock these websites offline. And I think what they had showed wasn't so much in the realm of sophistication, but what they showed was just how vulnerable we all were to these very rudimentary low-level attacks. You can switch to the next slide. So one of the things that you hear all the time when you're working in cybersecurity is this phrase, and it's been plagiarized to death, but originally it belongs to Dmitry Alperovitch, who was one of the co-founders of CrowdStrike. And what he said was there are only two types of companies, those that have been compromised and those that don't know they've been compromised yet. And so I set out to find out if this was true. And what I realized was that, yes, a lot of organizations were getting hit with, in some cases, millions of attempted security incidents every day. And many of those weren't successful, but many companies had been breached and had their intellectual property stolen. and were able to essentially bury these attacks because in the process, no one had stolen any PII, personally identifiable information that would have made it mandatory for them to report these attacks to government. And so everywhere you looked, there were breaches. It's just that some companies weren't set up to know whether they had been breached. And then other companies, when they did know that they had been breached, made every effort to hide that fact because of fears for their reputation or their stock price or class action lawsuits. And then something sort of miraculous happened, and you can switch to the next slide, which was that my own employer was hacked. So the New York Times was hacked, and I was actually able to embed with our security team for many months as we watched the hacker that we came to affectionately call the Beijing summer intern roll into our networks at 9 a.m. Beijing time and roll out around 5 in search of our sources. And in the process of watching how that worked, it was really just my sort of graduate level education in cyber attacks. And the big takeaway for me was that all of these agencies, all of these companies, these private companies, journalists, were getting hacked increasingly, not by anonymous, but by sophisticated nation state threats. And we were all being left to fend for ourselves. We were all basically left to defend ourselves from attackers that had potentially millions, hundreds of millions, billions of dollars of resources at their disposal. This slide just shows a couple of the major companies here in the US that had been breached right when I started at the Times. RSA, which was a big security company, you may have heard of the RSA Security Conference. Their secure ID token technology was stolen by a Chinese state-sponsored hacking group, and that was used in turn to breach defense contractors like Lockheed Martin. We learned about Benjamin Moore's paint formula being stolen by some of these Chinese nation-backed groups, the blueprints to the stealth bomber. And anytime you tried to see any legislation move in this space, you would actually always see it kicked down by lobbyists who argued that any sort of regulation, when applied to cybersecurity, and particularly the companies that operate critical sectors like the grid or water treatment facilities, would be too onerous, too burdensome for those companies. And fascinatingly enough, the organization that led the charge that killed one of these bills in 2012 was the US Chamber of Commerce here. And one of my favorite stories over this time is that at the time the US Chamber of Commerce was lobbying against any passage of any kind of cybersecurity mandate, they themselves had been so thoroughly hacked by a Chinese nation state group that they actually thought they had cleaned their networks. And then a few months later, one of the thermostats in their corporate apartment in Washington, D.C., they determined was still communicating with an IP address in China. And occasionally their printer would just print out reams of documents in Mandarin characters because these Chinese hackers were still inside their printers. And so I always think about that. Here is this lobbying organization arguing against the need for better cybersecurity standards and mandates, and here they were so thoroughly hacked that their corporate apartments had Chinese hackers inside. You can move to the next slide. So this was just the headline from the New York Times breach, and you can move to the next slide. So one of the things that happened, once I realized just how compromised all of our companies and critical infrastructure was starting to be by these nation state threats, we started seeing some of these hacks move towards very disturbing sectors. So I started reporting on Chinese hacks of American pipelines and oil companies. And what stood out to me was, one, just the determination and the creativity that was going into some of these hacks. I already mentioned the US Chamber of Commerce. Another one that will always stick in my mind was a hack of an oil grid, let's call it, an oil rig that they tried to get into this oil company's systems. And when they couldn't, they did some due diligence on the employees at this organization, and they saw that a few of them had liked this one Chinese takeout restaurant on Facebook. So what did they do when they couldn't fish these employees directly? They went to the Chinese takeout restaurant. They planted malware in the PDF takeout menu that you had to click on to make your order, and that's how they ultimately got inside this oil rig, was through the Chinese takeout menu at this restaurant that a lot of employees like to order from. Now, just given the onslaught of cyber attacks at that point that were aimed at stealing intellectual property from the United States, the initial thinking around these hacks of our energy infrastructure was that this was just more of the same. This was just intellectual property theft. They were just doing it to the energy sector. But a few weeks ago, the US Department of Justice actually declassified their findings that these were not intellectual property theft operations. This was battlefield preparation. This was the Chinese essentially trying to get a foothold into US pipelines in the event they might need to shut down a pipeline one day. And we all just got a very close look at what that would look like with the ransomware attack on Colonial Pipeline here, which is the pipeline that is the major conduit for gas and jet fuel and diesel to the east coast of the United States. And in that case, ransomware criminals didn't hold the pipeline hostage. They held the IT network hostage at Colonial Pipeline and demanded a ransom to unlock it. But it forced the company to shut the pipeline down itself, because with their billing systems frozen, they couldn't charge customers downstream. They couldn't see where these outflows were going. And so without an ability to charge customers, they shut the whole thing down. And that's when you started to see nonstop flights getting grounded, people panic buying gas at the pump. And one of the things my colleague David Sanger and I discovered in the course of reporting out this attack last June was a classified Department of Energy report that found that the United States as a country could have only afforded 2 or 3 more days of that pipeline being down. And it wasn't so much the gas and the jet fuel, it was actually the diesel, because so many of our chemical refineries relied on that diesel, and without it, the economy would have been in very bad shape. So that is in part why they ended up paying their ransom. You can move to the next slide. The reason I mention that attack is because I think if you want to get a sense of how vulnerable the West has become to cyber attacks, all you need to do is look at that Colonial Pipeline attack last June. As long as it is that easy to take out a major pipeline in the United States, we are in bad shape. And the way that criminals were able to do that attack is because Colonial Pipeline had forgotten to deactivate an old employee account. The criminals had stolen that employee's password a long time ago. They steal it from retailers who have your passwords all over the world, and they sell those passwords on the dark web. And Colonial Pipeline had failed to take a very basic but critical step, which was turning on multi-factor authentication. So that's all it took to take out one of the major conduits for gas and jet fuel and diesel to the United States. An old employee account that had never been deactivated when that employee left, and a lack of 2-factor authentication. Why does this matter? It matters because we are now entering this decade where we are seeing nation-state threat groups take out critical infrastructure for their own political purposes. This is Kiev, I believe. So in 2015, we saw Russia actually cross a major threshold in this sort of low-level cyber war that has been playing out for the last decade, when they turned off the lights and power to a large swath of Western Ukraine using a cyber attack. And then they did it a year later in Kiev. And they held some punches in the end. The power was only off for a few hours in both cases, but it was enough to send a message that Russia could do this. And when I went to Ukraine to interview the people on the ground who had run the forensics for these attacks, what they said to me was, listen, Russia has been testing out every capability in their arsenal. They've been phishing us, they've been hacking our media organizations, they've turned off the lights, and they've launched this attack that they did in 2017, where they detonated ransomware on all of Ukraine's federal agencies and critical infrastructure in a major attack that was called NotPetya, that appeared to be ransomware, only there was no way for victims to actually pay their digital assailants. And so it was just a way of wiping all of this data at these organizations. And what they said to me was, we actually think this was the GRU wiping the slate clean. So anyone who would come to Ukraine could not get a sense of all the experimentation and capabilities that they have been testing out on our systems for years. But the important thing for you to remember, they said, was that we don't believe we're the end target. We believe we are the test kitchen. And we think you, the United States and your Western allies, are the end target. Only when this comes your way, it's going to be so much worse, because unlike us, you are fully digitized. You've automated every part of your economy and your critical infrastructure and your elections. We still conduct our elections on pen and paper. But when something like this comes for you, it could do a lot more harm. And so you really need to pay attention to what Russia has been doing here. You can move to the next slide. So the opening salvo, I would say, for this decade was in 2010 when I joined the Times. I didn't realize it at the time, but that was the year that Stuxnet was discovered. So many of you are probably familiar with Stuxnet, but for those of you who aren't, Stuxnet was a joint attack by the United States and Israel on Iran's Natanz nuclear facility. And what they did was, using a series of vulnerabilities in Microsoft Windows software and also Siemens industrial software, which is the software that we use to control some of the industrial machinery in factories, at factories and the power plant, et cetera. They were able to get inside Natanz. We don't know who did it, but someone brought in a USB stick. They plugged it into the network. They unleashed code that made its way over to the Siemens computers that control the speeds of the centrifuges that spin the uranium at Natanz. And they used the code to speed up the rotors, the speed of those rotors, and then they would sit back for a few weeks. And then they would go back in and they would slow the rotors down, and then they would sit back for a couple of weeks. And all the while, if you were an engineer, an Iranian engineer at one of these facilities, and you were looking at your computer screen, there was this sort of Ocean's 11 element to all of it, where it would appear as if everything was functioning normally, when in fact, in the background, the US and Israel were taking out your uranium supply. And what it was really the digital equivalent of the Manhattan Project, only in reverse. It was a counter-proliferation effort. And it would have been a bloody masterpiece because it was designed to look like a natural accident, and ultimately, hopefully, would get Iran to the negotiating table when it came time to sign the Iran nuclear deal. And in many ways, it was successful. You know, it really destroyed ultimately a fifth of Iran's uranium supply, and it set back their nuclear ambitions back years. It kept Israeli jets on the ground because Israel had been threatening to bomb Natanz, and every simulation that the Pentagon did here showed that if that happened, even if the US looked the other way, it would have dragged us into a third war in the Middle East. This was around 2006, 2007 when some of these decisions were being made, and that is really when we were seeing the body count pile up in Iraq of American soldiers. So George W. Bush famously said, "Get me a third option." That third option was Stuxnet. And at the time, there was a classified US national intelligence estimate that ranked America's adversaries, and it was together with the GCHQ in the UK. It ranked our adversaries around the world in terms of their cyber capabilities. And that year that Stuxnet was discovered, because it did get out, the US and the UK determined that Iran, while having the will to do them harm with cyber capabilities, really lacked the skills to do so, and that it might even be a decade before they could pull off their own version of Stuxnet. Well, what happened was in 2012, we learned that Saudi Aramco, world's richest company, Saudi-owned oil company in Saudi Arabia, was hacked, and someone wiped out the data on all 30,000 of their computers. And what did they replace it with? With an image of a burning American flag. And that was really Iran's way of saying, hello, here we are on the scene. And when you speak to intelligence officials, they say it was really that attack that made them realize that they were way off in their predictions. Iran, our adversaries, don't need a Stuxnet to do harm. They just need rudimentary wiping code. And that attack showed that Iran could do a lot of harm with rudimentary wiping code. You can move to the next slide. After that, we just continued to see some attacks from Iran on banks in the US and the UK, where they were knocking them offline for a period of several months. And the idea was a little bit of revenge for Stuxnet. You can move to the next slide. When they didn't like something that Sheldon Adelson, who owns the Sands Casino in Las Vegas, said, he had said on a panel once that the US and Israel should nuke Tehran. They came for his casino, and they did the same thing to Sands Casino that they had done to Saudi Aramco. They completely wiped out their data. You can move to the next slide. And a year later, North Korea pulled off a very similar attack on Sony Pictures that some of you will remember, when they didn't like something that would transpire in this Seth Rogen, James Franco comedy, which was a very bad movie about the attempted assassination of Kim Jong-un. They took out the data at Sony Pictures. And the only reason I mention all of these in this chronology is that the attacks, as I was covering them, were only getting worse. But it was also clear that with every new high-profile attack, these attack groups were taking a page from the last playbook and then altering it slightly. So at Sony, they didn't just decimate the data like Iran had done at Saudi Aramco. They started leaking out executives' emails. And this was intended to embarrass them. We saw a lot of firings of those executives. And a year later, when Russia hacked the DNC, they started leaking out Hillary Clinton and John Podesta's emails in an attempt to interfere in the 2016 election. You can move to the next slide. All the while, we continued to see these attacks of critical infrastructure, only it was getting to be a very disturbing list of targets, I should say. So in 2018, I started to learn that we were finding Russian hackers probing our nuclear facilities. They'd successfully breached Wolf Creek nuclear plant in Kansas. And we were finding that they were getting so far into some of our power plants that they had gotten into the on-off switches, essentially. They could have switched off our power if they wanted to. And again, we had seen them already do this in Ukraine, but now here they were doing it in the United States. You can move to the next slide. The enemy is a very good teacher. So one of the things that we are struggling with here in the United States is a deterrence strategy. We have not figured out a good deterrence strategy. And I'll probably just end some of my slides here just to say, since we're running out of time, that without rules and norms in this space, what we continue to see is that these attacks are only getting worse. They are only coming for our critical infrastructure, and we're making it very easy on them. We continue to reuse passwords, to not turn on two-factor authentication, to use a decade-old version of Microsoft Windows that hasn't been patched in years, and that's really all it takes for these groups to get into our systems. And in the absence of any norms, we are stumbling toward this new era of mutually assured digital destruction. So a few years ago, my colleagues and I reported that actually US Cyber Command, which is the Pentagon's hacking outfit, had been given new leeway under Trump to hack without seeking presidential approval. And that among the first targets they took aim at with this new leeway was the Russian power grid, and that we were hacking the Russian power grid and making a pretty loud show of it. And so when my colleague David Sanger and I went to the National Security Council and say, here is what we have discovered, we're putting it together in a story, we assumed we would be in for a very painful conversation that journalists usually have with government officials, where they tell you you will have blood on your hands if you publish this. But in this case, what they said was very interesting. What they said was, we have no problems with you publishing this story. In other words, please do. We would like Russia to know we are in their power systems so that they might think twice before ever hacking into our systems. And, this is where we are. And I still believe that the US and our closest allies, like the UK and Five Eyes intelligence partners, are at the top of the heap when it comes to our offensive capabilities. No one has pulled off anything close to Stuxnet over the last decade, but they are getting closer. And being the best player on offense has not sufficiently deterred our adversaries from pulling off some of the attacks we are witnessing right now. And I do think the next geopolitical conflict will play out as a cyber war or will involve some major cyber component to it. And I think the country that survives that conflict will look a lot like a digital Israel, a country that can basically continue to run its most basic functions and services while surrounded by hostile neighbors and hostile activity. And right now, the US and the UK are not those countries. We are still making it very easy for adversaries and cyber criminals to get into these systems. And if you want to know what that looks like, just look around at the ransomware threat. Look at how many systems, core systems, hospital systems have been held up by ransomware. And in some ways, it's a blessing in disguise because it's finally giving us a visual element of this vast ocean of cyber threats that I've been covering for the last decade. And it's finally leading all of us to ask very important and basic questions like, why are we so vulnerable? How do we deter these attacks? How do we prioritize cyber defense? What does it mean governments have to do? What does it mean businesses have to do? And what does it mean that individuals have to do? Because really, this is a whole of society problem, and it requires a whole of society approach. So with that, I will shut up and let you ask me as many questions as you would like.
Nicole, thank you very much indeed. Extremely illuminating, possibly slightly alarming, but certainly illuminating. Thank you so much. Yeah, we do have some good contributions and questions, and I invite more. Douglas Andrews asked, will the recently passed and signed US infrastructure bill provide an opportunity to strengthen cybersecurity measures throughout the country's critical infrastructure? And how will that probably be implemented?
Great question. So yes, cybersecurity has become a top priority, and you see it in the funding from the infrastructure bill. So we're seeing hundreds of millions of dollars go to state and local governments to do things that we should have done decades ago. And so it does come with strings attached. And basically what it says is rip out that old Microsoft XP software that's been in your system for decades and put in place updated software that you can patch regularly. Do turn on multi-factor authentication, do use password managers, do conduct phishing training for your employees. And oh, by the way, these funds cannot be used to just pay out ransom payments, which we continue to see and which only goes towards cyber criminals' R&D efforts. So there are strings attached, but we're still trying to figure out what the enforcement strategy around that will be. I mentioned earlier, we tried to pass this bill in 2012 that would have mandated all of the above 8-9 years ago. And when that didn't pass, in its place, you sort of had these best practices, voluntary standards where we said, please do your best to try to follow these standards. And really, there was never any teeth to these standards. There was never any enforcement. So one of the sort of silver linings right now is that in the Biden cyber executive executive order, what he's done is put in place the first stick in this space. So instead of just saying, please do your best to meet these best practices, he said, okay, I only really have control over federal agencies, and I can use the power of the purse to have an influence over defense contractors and federal contractors. So what he did was he said, federal agencies, you must meet these standards. And contractors will rip out some of the red tape and we'll even let you self-certify that you meet these standards. But if we catch you lying to us, you can never do business with the federal government again. And when you think about Colonial Pipeline, what would that mean? Well, they butt up against federal systems. So if they have self-certified that they met those standards, that they used two-factor authentication, and then they got hit with ransomware and it turned out that, oh, nope, they didn't, they would be banned from doing business with the federal government again, and that could potentially put them out of business. So that is the first real stick we've seen in this space. Now, in terms of what's coming, I really recommend everyone do a close read of that executive order, because I do think that is just the first step in some major piece of legislation, call it the cybersecurity equivalent of Sarbanes-Oxley, that I think is going to come for critical infrastructure like banks and financial services. So do keep a close eye on how that executive order is playing out.
Thank you very much, Nicole. Now, Deborah Webster has no hesitation in plunging straight into the big issues. She says, between climate change, cyber attacks, and everything else, are you hopeful about humanity's future?
Yeah, just a softball.
From the smiley face she appends it with, I think she probably is, but she's clearly interested in your view.
Yeah, no, so to me, I always say climate change is our top national security threat. It is the world's biggest crisis right now. We need to figure it out. Just under that, I actually wouldn't even put cybersecurity. I would put disinformation. Unless we can all agree on basic facts, we're never going to make any progress on these issues. And then below that is cybersecurity. But I do think cybersecurity in some ways is the most imminent threat. It is already happening right now as we speak. And so am I hopeful? I have never been more hopeful in some ways, because ransomware has elevated this threat into the public consciousness. It's left policymakers no choice but to make cybersecurity a priority. To see President Biden make ransomware and cybersecurity the top issue when he met with Vladimir Putin for their first summit in Geneva last June. So, finally, I think we are talking about these issues, and that's always a good thing. But I do think we're in for a lot more short-term pain before we actually get around to solving these issues. And that's how I feel with climate change as well, with disinformation. I think a lot about cars and roads and that infrastructure. It took decades before we put in place seatbelts and stop signs and stop lights and sophisticated infrastructure that could basically mitigate a lot of these accidents and collisions. And that took almost 40 years. And now we're in a new space. We're online, and the speed at which we're accelerating everything makes it that much harder to put rules and norms and safety measures around this space. And we don't have 40 years to figure this out. The internet was only invented. We only saw the first email transpire 40 years ago. So think about what the internet will look like in another 10 years or 20 years. We have to figure it out now. And the good news, again, is that ransomware, as painful as it is leaving us no choice but to solve these issues before it's not ransomware, but a coordinated nation state backed cyber threat.
Thank you.
I don't know if that's uplifting or not.
I think so. Patrick Mack asks, is this anything new? Under Clinton, there were the doomsayers of cyber Armageddon, which ironically led in part to the netizen movement around declaration of independence of the internet. Russian and other military doctrines see cyber as, rather than the fifth domain, as part of information warfare, a much broader sphere of operations. We've only touched on hard cyber power here. I'd love to hear more about how the soft power is being used to help competitors eat themselves.
Yes, I mean, that to me, that's what I put in the disinformation camp. That is what I say is an even bigger threat right now than cybersecurity incidents. it is very clear that Russia's primary strategy here is to tie up its adversaries in knots of their own politics so that they aren't paying attention to whatever is happening over there. And we're seeing that everywhere, and it's terrifying here in the United States. We are just eating each other alive all day, every day, on Twitter, on the networks, and we can't get anything done. So, I think Russia definitely made a big push in this area. I think all they have to do now is occasionally come in and pour some gasoline on whatever the latest culture war is, and then we're back to the same cycle. And so how do we get out of that? I don't know. I used to think this was a public education problem, that we really needed to educate kids as early as we can about information warfare operations and about disinformation and about finding sources of facts that can be trusted. But right now, one thing that they have done, and here in the United States that has been done very successfully, is discredit the media, is discredit these major democratic institutions. And so no one can agree on which sources of information they trust. And that is a very dangerous place to be when you're talking about making progress on cybersecurity issues and climate change in the pandemic. And one of the things that happened when I was in Ukraine that I just think about all the time in the context of the pandemic is that when I was there in 2019, they were in the midst of a huge measles outbreak. And it had come to the United States because a community of Hasidic Jews go to Ukraine every year for this religious pilgrimage, and they brought it back to some of these Hasid neighborhoods in New York. And a lot of what some of the people on the ground were telling me in Ukraine and at the US Embassy was that they were continually finding these Russian trolls embedded in these Facebook groups of young mothers in Ukraine, legitimizing the vaccination debate and really sort of seeding the fears that these vaccines were dangerous. And so you saw Ukraine's vaccination rate was one of the lowest in the world, and that's why they were seeing that measles outbreak. And you could see that some of that was happening in the United States. I don't think some of it was Russian directed, but clearly they were willing to go as far as taking the time to go to these young mom Facebook groups in Ukraine to plant fears about vaccines. Why? Part of this larger strategy of tying their adversaries up in knots so that Russia can continue to do what it will. And in the pandemic, the biggest problem we're dealing with right here in the United States is vaccine hesitancy. And I don't know how much foreign fuel there is on these debates, how much foreign amplification. I don't think you need much because this has become a huge hotbed issue in the United States, but it is very disturbing to me to know that a foreign adversary was willing to go to those lengths in the course of measles. And now here we are with a pandemic that's become an endemic, largely because of vaccine hesitancy. So it is a huge issue. And I don't know, what the immediate steps are to take beyond the ones that we are taking right now with starting to put in place vaccine mandates and real steps, sticks for people who are still not getting vaccinated. But Delta is just one variant, and I really worry about what will happen over the next few years.
Hugh Purser asks a very interesting angle on it. Does the individual have any power to fight this battle, or are we totally dependent on government and big corporate action?
Yes, great idea. So, a lot of people liken the cyber threat to cyber Pearl Harbor, cyber 9/11, and I hate those analogies because, for one, we never saw Pearl Harbor coming. We didn't see the Japanese jet planes coming. We've seen the cyber equivalent coming for decades. And the other thing is, this is not just something that happens over there that governments and fighter jets are dealing with. This is a whole of society problem. And so the analogy I prefer is actually a cyber pandemic. This is something that is affecting each and every one of us by now. And governments certainly play a role in setting policy around these issues. Businesses play perhaps the most important role of all because here in the United States, 85% of our critical infrastructure is owned by the private sector. So they really are on the front lines a lot of these attacks and campaigns. But individuals also have a huge role to play with what we call cyber hygiene, the equivalent of wearing masks and social distancing in the pandemic. Until we are using password managers, updating our software, not clicking on phishing links and attachments, using two-factor authentication, we're all screwed. And a lot of people will say, well, I don't have anything that anyone would want, so I'm just going to keep using my password, 123 password, and hope for the best. And the thing is, it might not be you. You might not have anything that anyone's interested in at all, but you probably work for someone that has something that would be of interest to a competitor or a nation state adversary like China that could use your intellectual property. Or perhaps your software at your company makes its way into federal government agencies. And so you could be patient zero for an attack like the SolarWinds attack that we are unwinding right now in the US and to some degree in the UK, where Russia was able to use the software update at SolarWinds as a Russian Trojan horse to break into these federal agencies networks, these utility company networks, etc. So it's really important that everyone understands that they have a role to play in securing themselves and also the supply chain. And one of the things that I think is critical is that companies take the time to do serious cybersecurity awareness training, not the compliance checklist stuff, but the interesting stuff. At Google, one of the first things that happens when you join Google is Heather Adkins, their head of information security, walks new hires through the Aurora attack, which was the Chinese attack on Google systems a decade ago. And she says, this started because an employee clicked on a link in a chat that popped up on their computer screen, and that's all it took to let these Chinese groups into our networks and into the Gmail accounts of Chinese dissidents. So you all have a role to play in protecting those Chinese dissidents' Gmail accounts. And that shouldn't be laughed at, that soft communication around these issues will be critical to solving this threat.
Thank you. We've probably time for one more question. I think I have it here. This is from Callum Graham. In counterinsurgents armed warfare, it's vital that intelligence on a new enemy modus operandi is disseminated as fast as possible. In the cyber world, we're at risk of fines and losing reputation if we disclose details of a hack. How can we resolve this conflict?
And it's a critical question because of attacks like SolarWinds. If SolarWinds learned that they had been breached, but they didn't really understand why or for what motivation, and no personal identifiable information was stolen, they wouldn't have had to disclose it. Mandiant, which was how we learned about the SolarWinds attack, because they were hacked, and only in rewinding the tape did they realize that they had been breached right around the time they'd updated their SolarWinds software, didn't have to disclose that attack because, again, no PII data was stolen. They only did it out of sort of the goodness of their hearts or patriotic purposes, or because they're in the security industry and they knew that this was probably much larger than just Mandiant and SolarWinds. So it is critical that we learn about those threats. I mean, when you think about that, US Cyber Command has been hacking Russian systems with this strategy in mind of what we call forward defense or active defense. Basically, this idea that so long as the NSA and Cyber Command are hacking Russia systems, they can create a deterrence for Russian attacks here, and more importantly, maybe set up an early alert system so that they can see what groups like the GRU and SVR are up to before those attacks hit the United States or our allies' networks. And in this case, they completely missed it. They never saw this coming. It really took one private company, Mandiant, to raise their hand and say, hey, we're not required to do so, but we were breached. Someone stole all of our red team tools. We're still trying to figure it out. And then a week later, okay, we figured it out. It came in through SolarWinds. Every SolarWinds customer needs to check their networks. And lo and behold, Russia had used SolarWinds to break into the Department of Homeland Security, the Department of Energy, our nuclear labs, our utility companies. And thank God this was the SVR and not the GRU, because the SVR is not this group that has been shutting the power off and wiping systems clean. They are really, truly a classic espionage operation, we think so far. But we still don't believe we've fully eradicated those SVR hackers from our systems, which I find terrifying. So I mention all of this to say, this is why disclosure is so important. You know, maybe it's not you, but you could be used as a conduit. Your employer could be used as a conduit in these attacks. So we have to figure out incentives to get companies that have been breached to disclose these security incidents. But as you point out, what incentive does any company have to disclose these breaches when they would be subject to fines or you know, the reputational harm for disclosing these attacks, or class action lawsuits, or executives getting fired? They don't have an incentive to disclose these breaches. So in the United States right now, the hot topic is breach disclosure with liability protection. And you know, there are a lot of people inside the Fortune 50 here and in venture capital pushing hard on this liability protection piece. And I do think, in talking to government officials, they just want the threat data. You know, they just want to get the malware strains, the IP addresses and servers used in these attacks, so they can go out and warn everyone else in your sector that you either were hit or you could be an imminent target for that same attack. You know, they don't necessarily need your customer data or your employee data, but they do need to know, you know, what came for you, so they can go out there and warn and potentially deflect these attacks on others. So, you know, we're going to have to solve this liability piece. We are just going to. And even then, you know, companies are still going to be afraid that these breaches will leak to the media. The media will cover it, and there'll still be class action lawsuits. So it's not an easy issue, but we need to figure out how to get the incentives aligned on this. And that brings me to another point, which is solving for this particular problem, cybersecurity, as a free market society and a democracy, is much harder, will be much harder than countries like China and North Korea and Iran and Russia have, because we can't just wave an autocratic fist and say everyone use two-factor authentication. We can't do that. You know, we can't say stop using this software. We believe this is a backdoor. We can't do that. Companies will use the cheapest software. The US could not lobby the world to not use Huawei. And the other thing is, talent-wise, we are at a huge disadvantage because there is a cybersecurity workforce crisis right now. There are 3.5 million unfilled cybersecurity jobs worldwide. And in China, the way they're working around this is they are going to some of the best engineers at these private companies and saying, tonight you're going to moonlight with us. You know, that over and over again in sort of the documents that came out in the Snowden leaks, it showed that the NSA was having a really hard time tracking where some of these hacks were coming from, and they believed they were coming from private citizens who, just based on the targeting and who was getting hit, had some kind of probable intelligence feed requirement. And so essentially what this is a forced conscription policy. We don't have that here. We can't force the guy at Palantir or Google or Facebook or FireEye to work for the US government and our allies at night. And the US government has to compete with those companies' paychecks and perks. And you know, a lot of those companies don't have the same slow working bureaucracy that the US government has. And so when the US government does get great security engineers and convinces them to work in federal government, they want to go work on offense. They want to work at the NSA or the GCHQ or Cyber Command. No one wants to go work at a federal agency helping them remind employees to change their passwords and update their software, et cetera, et cetera. So we have to figure that one out. And again, that's going to be an incentives problem. And so I think, you know, the best thing that we can do is figure out how to align our incentives. And maybe that's tax credits for companies that subject themselves to a real penetration test, for instance. Bring in the nation's best hackers to hack their systems, give them a vulnerability report, and then do it periodically, every quarter, every year. And those companies and critical infrastructure operators that show that they are improving, their attack surface, limiting their attack surface, should get rewarded for that, potentially with tax credits. I just think it's time to start, getting out of our usual boxes around these issues and figuring out sort of creative ways to incentivize, better collaboration on these issues, because we're not going to get out of it without better collaboration. So I will leave you with that.
Nicole, thank you so much. I couldn't read my own handwriting at the start, so I got Nicole's surname wrong, and she was generous enough not to call me out on it. This is Nicole Perlroth, a genuinely world-class journalist in a genuinely challenging environment. Thank you so much. I would also like to thank the sponsors once more for enabling us to hold these sessions, to thank the audience for both attentive listening and some great questions. And I'll just remind there are a series of almost as interesting sessions coming up, and to encourage every single one of you to attend any of these that grab your interest, and I'm sure there'll be at least one, if not more. And it just remains for me to say thank you very much indeed. Have a great morning, afternoon, evening, wherever you are. Thank you so much for being with us today. Goodbye for now.